Welcome to a walkthrough of the 3rd through 5th grade Integrated Strand Lesson Internalization template. 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers should complete this lesson internalization template prior to teaching a lesson. The lesson internalization template helps teachers determine what instructional strategies and learning activities will ensure student success in meeting the primary focus objectives of the lesson and should be completed prior to delivering daily lessons. The 3rd through 5th grade Integrated Strand Lesson Internalization template is on the screen in front of you, and you will notice it's divided into 3 sections. The first section is where we will review the lesson. Then we're going to dive right into the lesson. And then finally, when you're feeling ready and comfortable to make this lesson your own, you are going to move on to the customize the lesson portion. We'll go into more depth on each of these as we walk through a grade 3, unit 2, lesson 4 as our example today. So let's get started with reviewing the lesson. As you can see, there are 3 parts to reviewing the lesson. We're going to spend some time reviewing the primary focus objectives and aligned standards within this lesson and identify how the primary focus objectives build towards student success with the standards. We're going to be using our teacher guide and really looking at the lesson introduction to guide us through. Then we're going to look at the formative assessments that are included in the lesson and really look at the alignment between those assessments and the primary focus objectives and how the literacy skills, knowledge, and vocabulary that students are going to be needing, we're going to focus on what that is in order to be successful on that formative assessment. We're going to do the same when looking at the check for understandings. These are a little bit different where they're found within each lesson. They're a quick check to make sure students are working towards mastery. We're going to look at how they are aligned with the primary focus objectives again, and as well look at those literacy skills, the knowledge, and the vocabulary students are going to need in order to be successful with those check for understandings. So this, as I said, is grade 3, unit 2, lesson 4. It is warm or cold-blooded. It's part of the animal classification unit. And so we're going to spend some time looking at this first page, which you will see at the beginning of every lesson within your curriculum. As you can see, the primary focus objectives are listed, as well as the formative assessment that you will be using within this lesson. So I just made a note here. In my teacher guide, when I am preparing for a lesson, I like to take notes on Post-it notes and stick it right in this section. Sometimes I'll highlight especially those primary focus objectives because I'm going to be coming back to those throughout my lesson internalization. So whichever system works best for you as you are planning for daily lessons, that's what I encourage you to utilize. For our purposes today, you'll see that I've just added some notes on the screen and I'll walk us through those and explain my thinking behind them. So for this lesson 4, you'll notice that there are 4 different primary focus objectives. One that is a speaking and listening objective, a reading, a writing, and then finally a language objective with the corresponding TEKS listed under each primary focus objective. There are also 3 different formative assessments that I will be utilizing in lesson 4 of this unit. These are all notated as student activity pages that are both in English and Spanish. As we know, the 3 through 5 integrated strand, all the materials are available in both English and Spanish. So as I'm highlighting these formative assessments, remember that's in this review of the lesson, I want to look into those assessments. What are my students going to be needing to know in order to be successful on these, and how are they related to my primary focus objectives? So you notice the first activity page, which is the first formative assessment listed. As I read through it, I realized right away this is directly tied to my reading primary focus objective, where students will identify supporting details in a passage about warm and cold-blooded animals. My second formative assessment is a field journal, and this I realized right away is directly tied to my writing primary focus objective, where students will write a short reflection about an interesting animal to further research. And then finally, the third formative assessment is directly tied to my language primary focus objectives, which is focusing on students being able to determine the meaning of words formed when an un or non are added to a known word. So we're really focusing on prefixes there. Then I went into my lesson and I found that check for understanding. And this particular check for understanding is really focusing on the main idea and supporting details, which are referenced in both my speaking and listening and my reading primary focus objectives. So now I've had a chance to review the lesson. I'm going to go ahead and dive right into the lesson. In this portion, we're going to look at each lesson component within the lesson and look at how that component sets our students up for success with both the primary focus objectives as well as the formative assessments and check for understandings. I'm going to be paying attention to what student engagement strategies are included in each component, what considerations I need to keep in mind to ensure that all students are able to access the grade level content in the lesson, and then finally what materials I need to have readily available as I am delivering each component within the lesson. So we're going to start off first with this lesson at a glance. This is at the beginning of each of your lessons, and I love the lesson at a glance because it gives a great overview of each component within the lesson. Not only does it give you an overview of the components, it gives you an idea of some grouping suggestions to consider for each component as well as timing. And then here's where all the materials are listed for each component within my lesson. So I love this. I just put check marks as I'm gathering, so I know that the activity page, all my students have access to that, and I will reference which page they need to be utilizing for each component of the lesson. But then I want to make sure I've got my main idea and supporting details chart out and ready to go, that my digital images are all queued up and ready to use throughout this lesson, as well as just having things such as blank paper, prefix chart. So you'll see each material that is needed for every different component is listed right there. So a great comprehensive overview of the lesson as a whole. So then I'm going to go ahead and look through the lesson, and I just made some notes. Here's a student activity book page that I'll be using. I want to make sure I have those projections ready to go for the lesson because as you can see, there are multiple different digital images and projections that I want to make sure I have them ready to go for my students, whether they're learning remotely or in my classroom. I'm going to be utilizing those. I also made a note here because this speaking and listening component is really focusing on the core vocabulary needed for this cold-blooded and warm-blooded, where we're going to be working through comparing those and looking at the supporting details and main idea as we're reading. So this is the core vocabulary I want to make sure my students are very familiar with. I also made a note here because I love how in this portion, the introducing the read aloud, we're giving students kind of a fun way to remember the 5 different animal groups that we're going to be following. And so this stands for all my best friends represent vertebrates. And so the A stands for amphibians, M for mammals, B for birds, etc. So I think this is such a fun way to really help that stick for my students. So I just highlighted that. Then as also part of the introducing of the read aloud, we're going to be doing a guess the main idea, which is part of that projection that I want to have ready to go, where we're going to play a game. And I think this is a great student engagement to really build our students' background knowledge. So I made note of that student engagement. Continuing on throughout the lesson, in the presenting the read aloud section, I read through all of my side supports. You'll notice all of these side supports that are included in every lesson. They're important to read through. When you get to the customization piece, you'll be prioritizing which ones you want to be utilizing. But as I read through the lesson, I like to take notes of which different supports some students will benefit from, and I will write those students' names on a Post-it note so I make sure. So you'll notice that this challenge that was listed as a side support really aligned closely to that primary focus objective, and I felt would really help set my students up for success with that, so I made note of that. Then I just made note of the different images, digital images that I want to make sure I have ready to go because I know those visuals really help all my students. When it came to this side support for English language learners, I wanted to make notes. What I will do, as I said in my lesson plan, is I will make notes of specific students who are going to need supports at these different levels. And it may just be that I have a couple students who need that beginning level support, or it may be that I have a group of students who are at that advanced level of support, but I want to make note of that as I'm preparing for the lesson. I also then really looked through all the different discussion questions and how they are aligning up to my primary focus objective. When we got to the word work portion, I just added that I want to incorporate some movement to really keep my students engaged in that portion of the lesson. So I'm continuing to look at the different components within this one lesson. This introducing the reading requires that I have that main idea and supporting details chart out, so I made note of that. I also really think that this is helping set my students up for success when it comes to meeting the primary focus objective, where students will be identifying those supporting details in a passage about warm and cold-blooded animals. Here in the discussing the reading portion, this activity page is intended to be completed independently, but I'm going to make note, I know I have a couple students that I'm going to need to provide additional support for when completing that particular activity page, so I'm going to list them there. I made a note that I need to make sure those field journals are available for my students. Then I also want to list which students I feel need this English language learner support. At the intermediate level, I have a couple that are going to need that support, so I'm going to list them there. And then I also just made a note that I want to collect this particular activity page as an additional check for understanding for myself on specific students who are working towards that mastery of that particular primary focus objective. So as you can see, that dive into the lesson portion is just really making notes of the things that you want to make sure you remember, where you really feel those primary focus objectives are being supported, and how to support all your students with success with the different components of the lesson. So now we're at the final portion of the 3 through 5 Integrated Strand Lesson Internalization template, and this is where you have the opportunity to customize the lesson. As I said, we really recommend that you move into these steps only when you are ready and feel comfortable with the lesson plans as they are written, and you're ready to make some additional adjustments to them. Once you get to a place where you are ready to do some customization of your lessons, it's important to remember you don't have to do every single thing listed in this portion of the template, but rather it's there to really help guide your focus and frame your thinking as you are customizing the lesson. Again, one thing as you teach these lessons, there will be particular pieces that stand out to you, particular areas where you had to provide additional support for students. So as you teach these lessons, that's when you feel more and more comfortable to really customize and make them your own after having experience with them. So some of the things we're going to be looking at after saying that is some possible misconceptions students might have in different components, and that's something you would figure out through experience having taught the lesson prior, but really paying attention to how you're going to provide additional scaffolds or extensions to really meet the needs of all your learners. Another part of the customization is looking at all the different lesson components, looking at what's making the text complex, using those text complexity rubrics that we looked at in the unit internalization portion. But then also, as I said, really looking at these sidebar supports and the questions that are embedded within the lesson to prioritize which sidebar supports you want to utilize or which questions you want to make sure you're addressing through the discussion. So really prioritizing those pieces. You might really incorporate other discussion techniques and formats for students as you are discussing the questions, and then what additional engagement strategies you want to incorporate during the different lesson components. So we're going to go back to how I had already annotated the lesson itself, but I've added some additional notes that are a little bit more customizing in blue. So for example, in the beginning when I was looking at those core vocabulary, something I added is I really want to provide visuals with the core vocabulary because I know that will make sure that all my students are provided with that support and that scaffolding to help them be successful with this primary focus objective. When it came to the student engagement that I really loved about this for building background knowledge on this within this lesson, I thought it'd be fun for this particular that guess the main idea game to partner my students up in teams as we're going through this game. And then finally, that one portion that I already highlighted as a way that mnemonic to really help our students remember those 5 animal groups. I thought it would be fun extension for those students who needed something additional to really to stamp their learning with this, is to give them the opportunity to illustrate the different letters within the mnemonic itself. Moving on, here when we're getting into presenting the read aloud, I remember that we had some great little objects within our science lab, so I wanted to bring some of those in for this portion. We have little animals, and so it's examples of cold-blooded and warm-blooded that I could present for my students as well to help with engagement. And then when it came to my discussing the read aloud, I put smiley faces by those questions that I really wanted to prioritize as part of my discussion. And then I also thought an additional engagement or discussion technique for this portion would be to group my students in small groups and then jigsaw out their answers. And then finally, a few other notes I added for the customization piece. When it came to discussing the reading, where we were doing that activity page independently, I really wanted to provide some additional scaffolded support for the following students. So I would list those students that I want to provide that additional scaffolded support for when it came to completing this activity page. And then I also added for the language component within this lesson to add some cards, so just index cards where students are writing the prefixes that we are utilizing in this portion of the lesson on cards so that they can manipulate them and add them to different root words, so that we are really reinforcing that understanding for the primary focus objective of determining the meaning of words when that un and non are added to known root words. So again, that customization piece is really just making this lesson your own after you feel comfortable with the lesson written as is, as you have used it and gotten just a deeper understanding of how you can really best meet the needs of the students within your classroom. So thank you so much for walking through this grade 3 unit 2 lesson 4 lesson internalization with me. And I look forward to you having the opportunity to do some lesson planning yourself. Thank you.